Hello and welcome to Season 9, Reformation Before the Reformation, the Great Western Schism, the Hussite Wars, and the Rise of the Ottomans. On 31st of October 1517, a hitherto unknown professor at the smallish University of Wittenberg published 95 theses. And by doing so, he unleashed a sequence of events that would fundamentally change the face of Europe and still defines communities and nations. The interesting question about the 95 Theses is not why Luther wrote them, but why they had any impact at all. Martin Luther stands at the end of a mile-long queue of learned and sometimes less learned men who railed against the decadence of the Church, called for a return to the actual text of the Bible, and demanded that the clergy lives like the apostles. But somehow, the message on that fateful day in 1517 gained traction across the Christian world in a way no previous attempt had before. Why? Now that is a question I believe will be the guiding line through the coming seasons. Something about the social, political, cultural, religious and economic landscape of early modern Germany must have provided the cinder on which the Protestant ideas could catch fire. Now, you will ask, why is Dirk talking about the Reformation? The last season ended on the late 14th century, a good 150 years before the day that changed Western Christianity. Aren't we supposed to go through all this chronologically? Oh yes, we are. But as we are moving forward at our accustomed pace, we will hit the Hussite Revolt that started in 1415. And this religious uprising has so many common threads with Luther's Reformation, it may be seen as a dress rehearsal for the actual event. Luther himself declared in 1519, Ich bin ein Hussite, I'm a Hussite. Spoiler alert, the Hussite Revolt did not lead to the fraction of the Catholic Church, but that makes it even more interesting. What were the circumstances that led the people of Bohemia and many other parts of the empire to take up arms to defend their convictions? How come they were successful, and by what means could a reconciliation ultimately be achieved? Knowing that will help us understand why 150 years later such a settlement failed to materialize, dividing Europe into Protestants and Catholics and spurning some of the bloodiest civil wars in history. To explore the causes and the impact of this Reformation before the Reformation, we will have to take a look at the decline of the House of Luxembourg, the emergence of the Ottoman Empire, the creation of Burgundy as a political entity separate from France, the defeat of the Teutonic Knights, and the Great Western Schism, with its resolution at the Council of Constance, where, amongst other things, Jan Hus was convicted and burned at the stake. We will dive into Jan Hus and his predecessors' thoughts and convictions, as well as the military innovations of Jan Žižka, and probably a lot more things I have not yet even thought about. Now that is quite a list of very diverse topics, which is why we'll have to change the structure of our narrative. So far, our storylines have mainly followed along with the lives of kings and emperors. Not necessarily because they were great men driving events, but because events centered around them, making their lives a good crutch to hang the story on. The period we are now entering was different. In the late 14th and early 15th century, the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire were on many occasions tangential to the overall picture, or even completely absent from the stage. So to give a proper account, we will therefore have to look at things from multiple viewpoints. Events or people who have taken top billing in one episode may make cameo appearances in others, all in the hope of painting a broad picture of this fascinating period in history. It will be challenging, but also hopefully fun and interesting. Okay, but before we start, I have to come to you cap in hand. The History of the Germans podcast is entirely free for anyone to enjoy, even to enjoy without advertising, which means the funding for it has to come from somewhere. And that somewhere is the generosity of our patrons, who make their ongoing monthly contributions from £2 a month on patreon.com/historyofthegermans or through a one-time donation on historyofthegermans.com/support. And why don't you join them? And let's thank Jean-Louis S., Jocelyn H.S., Marina H., Mark S., Michael E., and Miroslav D., who have made such generous one-time donations already. And with that, back to the show. Last season we kicked off with a 10,000 feet overview of where we were, what had happened before, and where the tides of history were ebbing and flooding. I think that worked quite well, and it gives listeners who are coming new to the history of the Germans a chance to catch up. If you're one of them, you're most welcome. Our starting point for this season is November 1378. Most precisely the 29th of November, the day the Emperor, King of the Romans, King of Italy and King of Burgundy, Karl IV, breathed his last. So why that date? It's because we're at a point of transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period, and Karl IV and his Golden Bull were in many respects the end point of some key historical trends that had dominated the Middle Ages. But what does transition from Middle Ages to early modern actually mean? In what way is this new epoch different from what went on before? The answer is in almost every possible respect: economic, social, political, cultural, and religious. So, let's start with the economy. The Middle Ages from the 10th century onwards were a period of sustained economic growth driven by a combination of improving climate conditions, the so-called medieval warm period, and a series of improvements to agricultural techniques. For instance, the use of heavier plows drawn by horses, something made possible by the invention of the horse collar and the horseshoe. Another key innovation was crop rotation that hugely increased yields. And social change, namely the replacement of slavery with serfdom and then with tenancy agreements, pushed productivity. These improvements drove a rapid rise in population, which in turn brought more and more land under cultivation. For Britain, where we have reasonable data, the population rose from 1 million to 5 to 6 million between the post-Roman period and the year 1300. By then, i.e. by 1300, about 10.5 million acres had been put under the plough. Again, a roughly threefold increase from the Roman period. At these levels, most regions in Western Europe had reached saturation, which led to a huge migration eastwards, where almost 10% of the population of the empire left their overcrowded homes in the Rhineland, in Flanders, Holland and elsewhere to search for pastures new in what is today East Germany, but also in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechia, the Baltic states, Prussia, and even further afield. This medieval warming period ended in the middle or end of the 13th century, and by the 14th century Europe was gradually getting colder, a process called the Little Ice Age that peaked in the 16th and 17th century and lasted until the mid-19th. Severe famines, as one had not seen for centuries, began in the 1310s. Natural catastrophes became more common. The Grote Mandrinke, the Great Drowning of Men in 1362, killed roughly 25,000 people, sank the town of Rungholt in Frisia, and turned 5,000 square kilometers of land into a shallow sea off the Dutch coast, an area far larger than the IJsselmeer and Markermeer that remain of it. The biggest humanitarian disaster was, however, the Black Death, the plague that killed roughly a third of Europe's population and kept returning in regular intervals for centuries. The combination of these two effects, the climate and the plague, meant that growth stalled and populations shrunk. Much of the land that had been cultivated in the 13th century was no longer viable in the 14th, and it was also no longer needed, as there were less mouths to feed. This change in population and economics then drove social change. The dramatic cull of people during the plague often hit the cities harder than the countryside, as people lived closer together there. For some cities, the Black Death brought about rapid decline. Some vanished completely. But those that survived quickly filled up again. They had not lost their economic advantages, which meant that there were suddenly a large number of job openings. For many a peasant, tired of paying ever-increasing rents to their landlord, life in the city became an attractive proposition. So, these surviving country dwellers left for the bright lights and freedoms of the towns and cities. And that not just happened during the Great Plague of 1348 to 52, but again during all the subsequent outbreaks that occurred every 10 to 15 years. Now this in turn caused some serious problems for the landowners, in particular for the knightly class. They had so far benefited from the population explosion that had created an almost inexhaustible supply of cheap labor to toil on their estates, either as tenants or as farmhands. But now that well had dried up, first through the disease and then the rural exodus that followed. If they wanted to keep their workforce, they had to pay them fair wages. The Bank of England did an analysis of wages going back to the 13th century, and the period of the Black Death was the only time before the Industrial Revolution when real incomes increased. Great for peasants' pockets, but a severe cut to the baronial profits. Profits already depleted by the decline in prices. Prices had dropped because, there were simply less people around demanding foodstuff. As the knights, these embodiments of the medieval world, saw their financial resources shrink, they experienced another, even harsher hit to their social standing. For centuries, the knight in his metal cocoon, riding his mighty warhorse, was a leopard tank of his day, a weapon so powerful only another knight could stand up to it. But that time was coming to an end. The battles of Morgarten, Mühldorf, and in Flanders had shown that infantry armed with halberds and cunning could inflict serious damage on armored riders. The success of the English longbowmen at Crécy and Poitiers should have penetrated the minds of the French nobility as much as it did their armour, though they still needed another reminder at Agincourt. Cannons appear from the late 14th century, at which point the hegemony of the knights on the battlefield is well and truly over. Moreover, tactics changed. The amateurish armies of volunteers that were the mainstay of the Middle Ages were replaced by bands of professional soldiers. The practice began in Italy, where the city councils got used to hiring condottieri to fight their wars rather than sending their precious sons out to the battlefield. The 100 Years' War saw the rise of the compagnie of mercenaries offering their services to either party in the conflict. And the civil wars of the interregnum in the empire were decided by who could hire and pay the best mercenaries. As the knights declined, their role at the top of the tree in the councils of the princes and emperors was taken by the merchants, bankers, and lawyers. When in the 12th century Frederick Barbarossa's main advisors had been the Duke Otto von Wittelsbach and Reinald von Dassel, the Archbishop of Cologne, 200 years later, Emperor Karl IV's chancery was staffed with lawyers from the lower nobility or city patricians. He listened more to the advice of his Nuremberg bankers, who could provide him with cash to pay for his mercenary armies or his acquisitions, and in whose mansions he much rather stayed than in some drafty castle. The rise of the merchants and bankers was no coincidence. Trade networks expanded in the 13th and 14th century. Ships had become larger, transport costs were falling. Shipping bulk goods, wheat, herring, wood, ash, base metals, even ore, became viable businesses, alongside the longer established trade in spices, furs, and beeswax. This was the height of the power of the Hanseatic League that gained a near monopoly on the east-west trade all the way from Novgorod and Bergen to Bruges and London. A specific area of growth for the German cities, and Nuremberg in particular, were advances in metallurgy. Mining and smelting had always been a key industry in the German lands ever since the silver mines of Goslar opened in the 10th century. But in the 14th century, new technologies were developed. One particular breakthrough exploited the fact that most copper ore in Europe contained traces of silver. The secret Zeiger process, developed by a Nuremberg merchant, enabled them to separate the two metals. It made the copper purer and hence more valuable, and left behind an amount of silver as a windfall. And this process was extraordinarily lucrative. Traders could make 6 times from the sale of the copper and silver than they had to pay for the copper ore. As economic activity in the cities thrived, they were able to translate this into influence and political independence. Under the feudal system that prevailed across Europe, cities were subject to the ownership rights of the prince on whose territory they were located, and whose forefathers had often founded them in the first place. But over time, some cities in the empire have been able to shake off their overlord. Places like Cologne, Regensburg, Mainz, and Strasbourg had paid off or chased off their bishops who had once ruled over them, and had become free cities. then the cities that were located on royal land benefited from the weakness of the central power. They would proudly declare allegiance to the emperor and, under duress, pay him taxes, but in all other respects, these imperial cities were as free as the free cities. And then you have places like Hamburg, where the city council simply forged a charter that had declared them a free and imperial city and pushed this claim through by force and fortune. But even where formal overlordship remained, as was the case with most members of the Hanseatic League, the cities enjoyed a large degree of freedom, at least in the 14th and 15th century. Which now gets us to the overall political picture. The great medieval dynasties of the Ottonians, the Salians, and the Hohenstaufen had expired by 1268. A centuries-long conflict with the papacy over leadership of Christianity and repeated attempts to bring northern Italy to heel had ended with a comprehensive defeat of imperial power. The last of these emperors, Frederick II, had died in 1250, excommunicated, militarily and physically exhausted, and increasingly paranoid. His son, Conrad, was never crowned king of the Romans and perished in the attempt to defend his kingdom of Sicily against Charles of Anjou, the papal champion. The last of the dynasty, Conradin, died aged just 17 on the executioner's block in Naples, having failed to oust the usurper of the Sicilian crown. After that, the empire had no effective leadership for 2 decades. 2 foreigners, Alfonso X of Castile and Richard of Cornwall, were simultaneously elected as kings of the Romans, but neither could assert much authority. In 1273, the Prince Electors, at that point a still somewhat fluid group, elected Rudolf of Habsburg, a count from the Aargau in modern-day Switzerland. Now, Rudolf was a truly impressive figure, a ruthless warrior, but commensurate strategist and politician. He had profited enormously from the collapse of the Hohenstaufen power, taking over lands and cities previously held by the imperial family. He was, however, still only a count, and his family had been relative parvenus. That may have been the reason the electors chose him, believing he would be a weak ruler who would grant them whatever rights and privileges they desired. As it turned out, Rudolf was nothing of that sort. He initiated a restitution policy, forcing princes and bishops to hand back the formerly royal lands to the king. Peter Wilson estimated that roughly 2/3 of the former imperial resources were recovered. Rudolf also embarked on a confrontation with the richest and most powerful of the imperial princes, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, the Golden King. Relying on the large silver mines in Kutna-Hora, Ottokar II had expanded his realm by acquiring Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and what is now Friuli and Slovenia. Rudolf outmaneuvered Ottokar and forced him to hand him the Austrian duchies. In a subsequent battle, Rudolf defeated Ottokar II, who died in the field. And with that, the Habsburgs took over Austria, which over time became the center of their power. Upon Rudolf's death, the electors refused to elect Rudolf's son, which would have created a new royal or even imperial dynasty. Instead, they chose another little count, Adolf von Nassau. Now, Adolf tried the same trick, this time going after the Landgraviate of Thuringia. But that plan failed. He irritated the prince-electors, who then deposed him and called back Albrecht von Habsburg, the son of Rudolf they had previously rejected. Albrecht defeated and killed Adolf and took control of the empire. Now, Albrecht's main interest was now to further expand his and his family's possessions. And the golden opportunity of the time was the Kingdom of Bohemia, where King Ottokar's family, the Premislids, had died out. There was a lot of back and forth, and just when Albrecht was preparing for another invasion of Bohemia, he was murdered by his nephew. Now, Adolf and Albrecht represent a new approach to the role of King of the Romans. These men looked at the title only as a way to expand their personal wealth, in particular using the royal prerogative to claim fiefs that had become vacant upon the extinction of the vassal's family. The empire and its interests were clearly secondary. Their successor was another little count, in inverted commas, Henry of Luxembourg. And the calculation of the prince-electors was again the same as before. Let's get someone with limited resources on the throne and then push him round. And again, their gamble did not work out. Henry VII was cut from a different cloth. He had grown up at the French court and had a much broader perspective. He saw that unless he gained the imperial crown through a coronation in Rome, the imperial title, and with it political power over the empire, would inevitably fall to the French king. Henry VII therefore set off for Italy, the first emperor to be crowned in Rome for almost a century. But apart from the coronation, his stay in Italy was a terrible failure. Like his predecessors, he was dragged into protracted Italian domestic conflicts that he could not resolve. His army perished before the walls of Brescia, his beloved wife succumbed to disease, and so did he, just a year later. But the House of Luxembourg did receive a windfall profit they did not even aspire to. And it was the most valuable of them all, the Kingdom of Bohemia. The Bohemian nobles, who had retained the right to choose their ruler, offered the crown to John, the son of Henry VII. Though Henry saw it as a distraction from his main objective, the Roman coronation, he was persuaded to let the Bohemians take his son home as their new king. John of Luxembourg would later become famous as the blind king of Bohemia, whose rather pointless chivalric deeds at the Battle of Crécy gained him the respect of Edward the Black Prince of Wales. After Henry VII's death, we have another simultaneous election of two kings of the Romans, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, Duke of Upper Bavaria, and Frederick of Habsburg, Duke of Austria. In 1322, Ludwig did emerge victorious at the Battle of Mühldorf and becomes the undisputed king. But by then, imperial power was already so diminished the title, its resources and prerogatives added only marginal advantages to its holder. The political landscape had become a system of three roughly equal-sized power structures. The House of Habsburg, centered around Austria and their holdings in southwest Germany, Alsace and Switzerland, the Luxembourgs as kings of Bohemia and counts of Luxembourg, and the Wittelsbachs as dukes of Bavaria and counts Palatinate on the Rhine. During the 30-year-long reign of Ludwig the Bavarian, the three parties carved up all vacating fiefs between them. The Habsburgs received Carinthia, the Wittelsbachs Brandenburg and Holland-Hennegau, and the Luxembourgs Silesia. Where they clashed was over the county of Tyrol, which controlled the important transalpine routes, including the Brenner Pass. John of Luxembourg got there first, gaining the hands of the heirs of these lands, Margarete Maultasch for his son Johann Heinrich. However, that relationship broke down and Margarete threw the Luxemburger out and married the son of Ludwig the Bavarian, without prior divorce. Oh, scandal. In the end, after Margarete's only child had died, she handed the county over to the Habsburgs, where it remained. Now, Ludwig managed to keep a lid on all these conflicts until in 1347 the kettle boiled over. The Luxembourg party elevated Karl, the son of the blind king of Bohemia, to become king of the Romans. Karl managed to overcome his opposition, partially because both Ludwig the Bavarian and the next champion of the Wittelsbach cause both died, but mainly through bribery. And these bribes were astronomical, adding up to about 1.6 million gold florins. To raise these funds, Karl sold, pawned and granted away almost all that was left of the royal lands and rights. Though he bought some of it back later, the net result was that from now on, any holder of the royal or imperial title had to fund pretty much the entirety of their administration from their personal fortune. And only very few could. Karl IV reigned for 30 years, a period during which he stabilized the situation in the German lands and issued the most significant constitutional document in the 14th century, the Golden Bull. The Golden Bull did actually not say anything fundamentally new. It set out that the king of the Romans was elected by a majority of the 7 electors, these being the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne and Trier, the king of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxon-Wittenberg, the Count Palatinate on the Rhine, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. These electors had been set more or less since the election of Rudolf von Habsburg in 1273, so all the Golden Bull did was to clarify exactly which branch of the respective houses was allowed to vote. It set out the voting process, location, and the like. It also granted the prince-electors king-like status in their own lands. They enjoyed all formerly royal rights and privileges, like the establishment of tolls, the raising of taxes, the minting of coins, the building of castles, and the establishment of cities. Their subjects had only limited recourse to imperial justice. Basically, they were completely autonomous, though still part of the empire. But again, that was not really a change from the status quo, just a written confirmation of it. The significance of the Golden Bull lay less in what it said than what it did not say. The Golden Bull makes no mention of the Pope at all, and by this omission it asserts that the Pope has no role in the choice of the future emperor. Hitherto, the popes had declared an explicit right of approbation, i.e. they reserved the right to reject the election if they did not agree with what came out. This was one of the manifestations of the superiority of the popes over the emperors that had been the key intellectual and political battleground of the Middle Ages. Pope John XXII and Ludwig the Bavarian had clashed over exactly this question, the approbation. This conflict resulted in the excommunication of Ludwig, his family, and in the end, the entire empire. Ludwig managed to hold on to his throne and gained the support of the imperial bishops, abbots, and clergy in his defiance of the papacy. He even got crowned in Rome, not by the pope or cardinal, but by the people and senate of Rome, much like the pagan emperors of old. At the Kurverein zu Reims, the electors asserted their right to elect the future emperor without any interference from the papacy. This statement was obviously not recognized by the papacy, but when Karl IV issued the Golden Bull, which in a more elegant way said exactly the same thing, the Pope did not object too loudly. And that brought the long-lasting papal-imperial conflict, that central axis of medieval politics, to an end, and laid the foundations for a new constitution of the empire, as yet unknown. If we sum up the political situation over these 125-odd years, from 1250 to the death of Karl IV in 1378, one question should come up, which is, how could the empire afford a hollowed-out central authority, squabbling princes, excessive bribery, and a papal interdict on top? Why did they not get invaded? Any other state with that level of dysfunction would not have been able to maintain its territorial integrity. And that gets us to something that nobody ever seems to mention. For almost 300 years, ever since the battle on the Lechfeld in 955, there had not been any external threat to the empire's borders. And this is truly astounding. If you look at France and its constant wars with England, Spain's Reconquista, the never-ending wars between the Scandinavian kingdoms, Poland's conflict with the Lithuanians and the Teutonic Knights, it becomes clear that in this respect, the Holy Roman Empire in the 13th and 14th century was an exception. Basically, the empire was exceedingly lucky. On its eastern border, Poland had disintegrated into dozens and dozens of smallish duchies ruled by descendants of King Boleslav III, the Wrymouth. The powers to the east of Poland had been wiped out by the Mongols, who themselves made only one brief effort to move west before their urge for conquest died down. So instead of being a threat to the empire, Poland and the East became an area of conquest and immigration. First, the buffer states of the Slavic Wends between the Elbe and the Polish border were taken over by Saxon nobles, who founded Brandenburg and then the various Saxon duchies. Some of the Slavic elite, like the Dukes of Mecklenburg and Pomerania, were co-opted into the empire. The Teutonic Knights were called in by a Polish duke to deal with the pagan Prutzi and established the Order's state in Prussia. The Hanseatic League founded cities all along the Baltic coast. Equally, the Hungarians had integrated into the west, and Bohemia was part of the empire. The Scandinavians in the north were preoccupied with their constant wars of succession, often finding themselves dependent upon the Counts of Holstein or the Dukes of Mecklenburg, or dealing with the Hanseatic League. Finally, in the west, the kings of France had focused on their internal consolidation rather than outward expansion. Their 200-year wars against their largest vassal, the King of England, left little resources for forays eastwards. As for the south, Italy was a key battleground for medieval imperial politics, but there was always more of a civil war between the papal and imperial faction, not a war of conquest. As we head into the end of the 14th and 15th century, this picture changed considerably. the Kingdom of Poland recovered from centuries of total fragmentation. Under Ladislav the Elbow High and Casimir the Great, the Piast duchies united back into a kingdom and took an ever more aggressive stance against the Teutonic Knights and the encroaching Margraves of Brandenburg. At the same time, King Louis the Great of Hungary led a renaissance of Hungarian power and played a key role in imperial politics. And all that happened on the doorstep of Bohemia, the main power base of the imperial family. Equally, the French monarchy had started nibbling away at the French-speaking imperial bishoprics of Cambrai, Toul, Verdun, Metz and Liège. Further south, Provence, still part of the Kingdom of the Ararat and hence imperial territory, was ruled by a cadet branch of the French royal family. The Franche-Comté, once home to Barbarossa's wife Beatrice, was gradually transferred to France in the 14th century. The issue of French encroachment became an increasingly important topic, in particular under the Luxembourg emperors Henry VII and Karl IV, who hailed from that area. Karl IV used the weakness of the French monarch after their defeat at the battles of Crécy and Poitiers to reassert imperial authority by holding a massive diet in Metz in 1356, where the Golden Bull was finally proclaimed. However, once France had regained the territory ceded to the English in the Treaty of Bretigny, they turned their gaze again eastwards to the empire. In the last year of his life, Emperor Karl IV travelled to France to find a compromise with Charles V over the former Kingdom of Burgundy and the succession to the Hungarian and Polish thrones. In this deal, details are unknown, it seems as if Karl IV had handed over de facto control of Provence and the Rhone Valley to the French crown in exchange for his son's succession in Hungary. What we can conclude from that is that the main political axis had shifted from north-south to east-west. In the Middle Ages, emperors were focused on Italy and on the papacy, but by the end of the 14th century, most of time and effort is spent on France, Poland, and Hungary. And, just generally, the center of power in the empire shifted east. The medieval emperors had their main landholdings and support based in the south and along the Rhine River. But now, under Karl IV, imperial power relies on Bohemia, with its satellites Silesia and Moravia, and the recently acquired Margraviate of Brandenburg. With external pressures mounting, fundamental reform of the empire becomes ever more pressing. To put that into perspective, King Edward III of England had borrowed 1.1 million gold florin to fight the 100 Years' War against the French. The total income of the emperor from his imperial resources was now just 20,000. If he wanted to raise exceptional taxes, the only place he could do that was in the imperial cities. That would occasionally heed his demands, but not always. The other source of funds were the merchant bankers in these cities, who lent considerable amounts against huge interest and upon handover of valuable collateral. Despite their importance for the functioning of the empire, by 1378 the cities were most unhappy with the state of affairs. Being dependent upon trade, their main concern was the safety of the roads and rivers, the tolls charged, and the stability of the currency. When Karl IV designed the Golden Bull, he initially wanted to address all three subjects. He aimed for a communal policy on coinage, guaranteeing the levels of precious metal content, restrictions on tolls, and a general peace, a Landfrieden. The Landfrieden would have been a permanent ban on private violence, requiring the princes to eradicate the robber barons and recognize a system of law courts that based their decisions on written laws. In exchange, the cities would have to refrain from forming leagues and associations for mutual support, i.e. doing all these things by themselves. But these provisions were never passed. In the negotiations, the princes managed to water the rules on mints, tolls, and the peace down to practically zero. All that was left in the Golden Bull was the ban on the formation of city leagues. So, no points to Gryffindor for figuring out what happened next. With the central government unable to guarantee safety from illegal and legal robbery, the cities defied the Golden Bull. The Swabian cities, most of them imperial ones, formed a league led by the city of Ulm. They refused to swear allegiance to Karl's son Wenceslas, which resulted in a war. The imperial army failed to scale the walls of Ulm, and the emperor had to reach for a compromise that sanctioned the Swabian League. And the war boosted the confidence of the citizens of Ulm to a point that they gave their parish church, the Ulmer Münster, the tallest church tower in the world. or at least they tried. The tower was only completed in the 19th century. Another even more unusual league formed in the southwest. Imperial cities of Zurich, Bern and Lucerne joined the forest cantons of Uri, Schwyz and Nidwalden in an agreement of mutual support against their not really that oppressive overlords, the House of Habsburg. But it's not only the economic, social and political culture that has fundamentally changed by the middle of the 14th century. There's also a huge cultural shift. When we talk about culture in the Middle Ages, what we're actually talking about is religion, and even more specifically the Church and its head, the papacy. Ever since the 10th century, religious history was driven by the constant demand for reform of the Church. Given the importance the afterlife played in the minds of people in the Middle Ages, the quality of the Church personnel who performed the holy sacraments was of crucial importance. A sinner wanted to be sure that his absolution was valid, so that his time in purgatory was really shortened. And for the sacrament, be it Eucharist, baptism, confession, confirmation or last rites, to be valid, it had to be performed accurately, something only a competent and properly anointed priest could ensure. And even though the papacy had confirmed many times that even sacraments administered by unworthy clergymen in an inaccurate manner were valid, the people still demanded better. And these reform efforts came in waves. Once disappointment with the established church reached boiling point, reformers gained traction proposing changes. The Cluniac abbots, St. Peter Damian, Anselm of Canterbury preached reform in the 11th century, Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th, and St. Francis in the 13th. For most of this period, the papacy was able to retain control over the reform process. They usually achieved that by co-opting the movements into their system, be it as Cluniacs, Cistercians or Franciscans. This, combined with the relentless persecution of those reformers they branded heretics, kept the popes in charge. But in the 14th century, the papacy lost control of the reform agenda. They had moved to Avignon, where they spent their days under the watchful eye of the French monarch and doing their bidding, even when it was sanctioning a raid on the Templar order. In this period, the church became much more efficient as an organization, gaining more and more control over the local bishoprics and even individual clergy positions. At the same time, it also improved its fiscal capabilities, collecting tithes more consistently, drawing the first-year income of newly elected bishops and clergymen, and issued indulgences as a way to monetize their store of holiness. This process made the Avignon papacy appear greedy and worldly to the common man, and moreover, it made it unpopular with the local clergy, whose autonomy and income they had seized. Pope John XXII, a lawyer more than a theologian, put oil in the fire when he pressured the Franciscan order to give up its vows of poverty. He reasoned that the image of a poor Franciscan habit next to a bejeweled cardinal made the latter look bad. This debate, that had quickly become a debate over whether the church as a whole should be as poor as Jesus had been, had a devastating impact on the perception of the papacy. The Pope was seen as endorsing the worldliness of the church rather than fighting it. And worldly the church had become. Teenage archbishops, drunk parsons, dissolute monks and lustful nuns returned not just as tropes in folk tales and bawdy songs. Having lost the moral high ground, the popes saw their hold on political power wane. When Pope John XXII excommunicated the elected king of the Romans, Ludwig IV, the Bavarian, the move backfired badly. Ludwig marshaled a coalition between the Franciscan dissenters and the imperial church against the pope. For almost 30 years did the church in German lands live outside the reach and in defiance of the papacy. Even when the papal candidate Karl IV replaced Ludwig, he quickly shed the mantle of papal protege. Nobody wanted to be a Pfaffenkönig, a pet of the church. Karl IV did formally reconcile the empire with the Holy See and the interdict was lifted, but the hold of the Pope over the empire was broken, as the Golden Bull made clear. The calamities of the papacy did not end with the Golden Bull. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome from Avignon, but there he died just months later. The cardinals elected a new pope, Urban VI. How free and fair this election was depends on what impact one ascribes to the Roman mob that had gathered outside, threatening to kill everyone inside unless they chose a Roman pope. So once back in Avignon, the cardinals declared the election of Urban VI null and void and elected a new one, Clement VII. We now have two popes. Urban VI was recognized by several powers, including the Emperor and the King of England, whilst Clement VII relied mainly on French support. The Great Western Schism was born. As the two popes were preoccupied with their internal squabbles, hope for church reform receded further and further. The inability of the papacy to lead a successful reform program left a void. Whenever that had happened in the Middle Ages, the emperors had occupied this empty space, claiming universal responsibility for Christendom. But that claim had moved so far away from political realities of the day, even pious rulers like Karl IV could not really take up the mantle anymore. Which meant the reform debate was left to the laity and the intellectuals. Men like Dante, William of Ockham, Marsilius of Padua and Petrarch developed entirely new concepts on how the church should be organized. Marsilius, who's one of the most unfairly overlooked political thinkers in European history, was the most radical. In his Defensor Pacis, the defender of the peace, he declared that all laws that bind men in the here and now derive their legitimacy from the acclamation of the people. A ruler rules only on the support of the ruled, not by divine right. Hence in the empire, it is the emperor who makes the laws in agreement with the ruled, represented by the prince-electors. The pope, on the other hand, has no power in the temporal world. His realm is only the spiritual world. Marsilius' writings gained a lot of traction. They were translated into French, Italian and German, which indicates they were read not just by the Latin-speaking intellectual elite, but much more broadly. Other thinkers, namely John Wycliffe, who we have not yet talked about, developed these ideas further. What helped the spread of new concepts were also the new universities that had sprung up across Central Europe. Prague University opened in 1348, Krakow 1364, Vienna 1365, Pest in Hungary 1367, Heidelberg 1386, Leipzig 1409 and Rostock in 1419. Charismatic preachers spread their message of the sinfulness of the official church and the urgent need for reform. In particular in the empire, which had been detached from the papacy for decades under Ludwig the Bavarian, the population was already very skeptical of the ability that reform could be achieved from inside the church. And that is where our story begins. Next week, we will kick off by looking at Karl IV's successor, King Wenceslas IV, who inherited what looked like a stable and well-sorted reign, even though several key reform projects were still unfinished. Will he be able to continue in his father's footsteps, deliver the Landfrieden, protect the empire against its external foes, and resolve the Great Western Schism? Well, let's see. And whilst you wait, you may want to brush up on some of the earlier episodes that go into a lot more depth on some of the topics we've just discussed. In particular, the episodes 149 to 151, where we discussed the reign of Ludwig the Bavarian, which was a crucial period when the empire and the church drifted apart. Or if you need a refresher on how the imperial power fell apart, the episodes 73 to 77 trace the story of the civil war between Philip of Swabia and Otto IV that brought a free-for-all for the imperial princes, and then the early years of Frederick II, who had to accept the status quo. Or if you'd like to hear more about the Hanseatic League or the Teutonic Knights, you can find these as separate podcasts, unimaginatively titled The Hanseatic League and The Teutonic Knights, wherever you find the history of the Germans. You can listen to all of these on historyofthegermans.com as well, where you can also support the podcast by signing up as a patron or by making a one-time donation. See you all next week.